Comparison of reports of epidemiology studies posted as bioRxiv preprints and published in peer-reviewed journals. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and I apologize for being here again. I know for diversity reasons we wanted other presenters, but my female colleague couldn't come here. And even though our three mentors, Lex, Steve, and John are here, and they are much more handsome than me, but we felt that a white male professor does not really do diversity justice rather than a younger researcher, so that's why I'm here again. I would also like to apologize for yesterday. I intentionally wanted to be a little bit provocative yesterday and asking for your data. I think we are all an amazing group here, but if we do share this data, then we'll see more of these studies like this to show what actually happens to peer review, and I hope this will motivate you to do that. I should use the clicker as well. So yesterday, as you know, I spoke about the studies where we looked at all the other this research that looked at differences between either submitted paper or a published paper. And as we've seen even in the talk before me, very little seems to change. And because of that, we wanted not only say what others have done, we wanted to conduct our own study. We actually started this when I was on my first year of postdoc and got delayed because of many other things. So we started this before the pandemic, and this was analysis of epidemiology papers at bioRxiv. It was at a time when epidemiology papers were posted at bioRxiv. That does not happen anymore. bioRxiv does not accept anymore RCTs and epidemiology papers. They all go to medRxiv, but at the time they were going to bioRxiv, so we looked at them. And till December 2019, there were 1,500 of these epidemiology preprints posted on bioRxiv. Of those, till January 2021, when we were doing this study, 60%, around 60% were later published in journals. And so we, of those, took only those that had one single preprint version. So not those that had different versions. We talked about reasons for that now. And we did a sample size analysis to calculate how many of those to sort of look at to estimate differences between one and the other version. We did this based on a sample size and analysis of precision, and we looked at 47 outcomes. Now, if you remember yesterday, I said that all these 40 other studies looked at 150 different outcomes, but this one complicated the matter even more. And this was predominantly my fault because as an editor, I was also very much interested in a lot of these stylistic changes that happen to manuscripts. Majority of the changes were analyzed qualitatively, meaning that we used words compared to versions of a document option, and basically it highlights what is added or what is deleted from one section, and that's how we manually compared. Of course, when it comes to number of words, number of references, these things, those were numerical comparators, but the rest were really looking and reading at these papers and analyzing the differences. The 47 things that we looked at are on this slide. They go from many stylistic changes to, number of words, number of titles. Is the title a question or is the title an answer to the question? And does the authorship number change? Does the byline order change? Are there shared authors? What is the structure of the abstracts? Do they call it introduction, methods, results, discussion, or did they call it something else? Same for the manuscript, including those maybe some thinking more important differences on, do the results change? Do the p-values change? Does the conclusion change? But also, I was interested also as an editor, do the data statement availabilities changes, do the conflict of interest change, and a lot of these. Of course, I don't have time in 10 minutes to go through all 47, so this is going to be very selective reporting of the results, but I think you will still see that some of the things are the same. So we analyzed 121 manuscripts, pairs. They were published in 73 different journals. Majority were published in PLOS or PLOS-related journals, and the medium impact factor of the journals where they were published was 4. Now, when we look at the medium impact factor of that field itself, which is 2.1, this would indicate actually that the papers that were posted at preprint at the beginning when they were accepting them could have been of a higher quality, if we take this as a measurement of quality, than the ones that we find in the field. Let us not forget that the bioRxiv started in 2013. The first epidemiology paper was posted on a preprint survey in 2016. So it is possible that those who were more confident of the results were posting these preprints, and these may not represent the epidemiology field as itself. The median time from posting of the preprint to publication was 206 days. 89% of these pairs any 90% of the journals had information on submission dates, so we could actually compare when was the preprint posted to compare when was the journal version submitted. And in our sample, 27% of these preprints were posted after the submission in the journal. So potentially there could have been an effect of the peer review. However, we looked at these and we didn't find that them to be different. And I'll show you a few examples why that is not so. Now, so when we come now to the results, almost 25% had changes in the title. None of those I would really classify as significant changes, but there are changes that say that editorial work or other work is doing something to do that. There were 6% of them that had changes in the number of authors. Five had addition of authors, 2 had removal of authors, 1 had removal of the consortium in the name of authors and just moving into the acknowledgement section. When we come to abstract changes, p-values changed in 5% or 6% of these manuscripts, and those was what we call previously sort of these more significant changes. But there were much more changes that we look at things. So when we look at declaring objectives, primary or secondary, are clearly described in them, almost 30% of these pairs had changes in defining what the object of the study was. In 7%, sample time changes, and of course, like the presenter before me, we've seen that the concordance of that, those were the p-values changes, was always those where the sample size also increased. Results, we had actually 68% of pairs that added additional outcomes or additional analyses. Now, bear in mind, we were looking only at the main manuscript. I cannot tell you, did these additional analyses, did the authors did them but chose not to report them, where they may be available in some appendixes that were not available to us to look at. This could have been done before, but what we know that they were not reported in the preprint version, but were later reported in the published version. Again, they did not change the main conclusions. The main conclusions, and we looked at that in 2 different ways. One, we looked at the first sentence of the conclusions where they describe the primary outcome of the results, and that only changed in 10% of these articles. When we looked at the statements, there we see much bigger improvements. When it comes to the conflicts of interest, almost 60% of preprints added in the published version declarations of conflict of interest. I have to say that more than 90% of these were actually saying there were no conflict of interest, but journals had inclusions of those statements. Similarly to data sharing statements, 40% added them. Of these, actually majority were saying that the data was either available or available on the request. This is one of the reasons how we also knew that those that posted the preprint after the submission are more likely the versions that were actually submit before the submissions of the journals, because why wouldn't, if your paper went through peer review and you posted it later on the server, why would you not include this information as well? So we don't think that when this information was not added, that would be, you know, that this is a version that came after peer review. We believe that it was really the authors who were posting these just as a maybe, you know, reasons to have a green version out there for the audience. When it comes to number of references, on average, 6 references were added in the published version. Most, again, what we talked about and what I talked about yesterday, these were additions to references in introduction or discussion sections. And maybe just a final note of here, 50% had additions of limitations. Now, I cannot assess how important it is to add one more sentence in a limitation, and is that really important for us? Do we find a study to be much more robust if there is one more extra sentence in the limitation section than if there isn't there? But we know that something did change. So things do change, but the question is, do we tailor this as more cosmetic changes or copy editing changes? And are they done because of editors or reviewers? That I cannot tell you. We don't have access for these manuscripts in the peer review reports. And I don't know if these changes would happen because of editorial interventions or the reviewer interventions. What we did see is that the majority of statements were related to the fact, does a journal mandate that you have these statements? And because many of these papers were later published in PLOS journals, and PLOS journals required that you have a data availability statement and conflict of interest statement. That's why we definitely saw an increase in this. One difference of bioRxiv compared to medRxiv is that bioRxiv does not require, like medRxiv, that the data availability and conflict of interest statement is submitted during the submission in the submission process. So that's why maybe in the, you know, during the preprint posting, this is not something that authors are doing on their own. And we've been talking about this for 2 days, so I won't re-emphasize everything that I said today, but I think the more we increase and the more we publish the submitted versions, the more we'll be able to see what those changes are. If it turns out that the majority of changes that happen are increases in transparency and maybe clearness of reporting, then maybe we should consider what it is that the peer review was meant to do and what it does. As a peer reviewer, would we be willing to publish a badge of accountability, of accreditation that this methods and results in this paper as peer reviewed with me are solid? I think we often hide behind the words of peer review, meaning that that is what is meant by peer review. But if we look at this, it doesn't mean that that is that. I'm not sure how many of us as reviewers would really say that we agree or that we stand by what the authors say. We hide behind the authors and not often what we do as reviewers. So thank you.
Thank you, Mario. I have a question over there already lined up.
Hi, Les Citron, Current Medical Research and Opinion. Thanks so much for your presentation. It's interesting to see changes being made through the process of publication. And we all know that some journals are highly curated and lots of changes are mandated by the editorial staff at the journal and have really, you do what you need to do to get your paper published. It would be really interesting if you have access to some of the papers that were in the preprint server submitted to a journal that publishes what is submitted and the interim versions of that article as it goes through peer review and the responses to reviewers and so on. That would be interesting to see if the version submitted to the journal is the same as the preprint version.
So I can comment directly to that from my own journal. So Research Integrity and Peer Review Journal, published by BMC and Springer Nature, is a fully open peer review journal, and authors have an option to submit the submitted version on a preprint server in review service of Springer Nature. So there's a bunch of those that we have. And luckily for us, there has been a paper of a researcher completely unrelated to us who has looked at the changes that happened to our journal, where we have actually exactly what you ask. The submitted version, all of our reviews, including comments of me as an editor and what has changed and then where things could go. So there are journals doing that, and I think we'll be able to show more what's happening there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that careful work. We've seen a number of papers over the presentations the last 2 days where people compare what's been published as a preprint and then what's published subsequently in the journal. In my interpretation of the evidence on peer review is that the value in peer review is to improve what you decide to publish. Okay, so it's inevitable that there are going to be changes between what's submitted and what's published in the better. I mean, that would be my kind of prior hypothesis in terms of better journals. So the real question, what I'm trying to get at is, what are you trying to work out here? What's driving this kind of field of research? And then a related point is that presumably what we should be really looking for is that are there meaningful changes between the preprint, whether it's on bioRxiv or medRxiv, and what's published? What we've seen in both the presentations today is actually the main findings were consistent and the conclusions were unchanged. You would expect improvements in the other points that you've highlighted.
So I think one of the goals is that we start admitting when an excellent paper that comes to us as editors is excellent and there's nothing for us to do, and that it isn't us that made it better, it was already great. It's the researchers who did the work, and it is wonderful work, and we've just published it. And I think we often hide behind the peer review process saying that we contributed a lot because they published it as they choose us, they come to us, and we can admit when that paper was perfect, because every other journal would be willing to publish it when it is perfect like that. If it goes down the cascade of things and doesn't change, it still means that it was done in a way that we as a society of scholars find acceptable for publication. So it doesn't mean it will change the, maybe practice in everyday life. It doesn't mean that it has the most important results for the changing of humanity, but it is still as produced and analyzed as we would expect from the scholars in our field.
Okay,
and I think that's what the goal
outside. But I can't think of a single paper that we've ever published at the BMJ that's come in and then not been changed. And if you're doing your job as an editor, the paper will be changed. That's number one.
As an editor, I believe that.
Yeah.
But please show us the data.
Well, I could show you the data. We could do you could look at any sample of our papers. You can go to our website. All the reports are on there. Everything changes. So I think the primary job of an editor and peer review is to improve the quality of what you've decided to publish. So that is really a function of the editorial task. And in terms of hiding behind, I'm trying to understand this point you're trying to make, because the point is, at the end of the day, as editors, we're appraising the research, we're publishing the research, but ultimately the work remains the responsibility of the authors. And that's how peer review in medical journals and scientific journals operates, because we cannot, vouch for everything that's in each single paper. I mean, it's all, the whole system relies on transparency and trust, and on us trying to improve the quality of what's being done. But we can continue the conversation outside.
No, I agree, but I think we've all seen in the last 3 days that we're working from not accepting so much trust, but actually having proofs of that. We're wanting the universities to confirm that the data was collected correctly. We don't want things that happened during the COVID that we don't know where the database comes from. We want approvals that that data is true. We want that data to be public, so that that trust is no longer just the trust because you submitted it, but we actually have that data. We can replicate it. We can reproduce it. We had quality controls during the time when it was collected. And then that trust becomes no longer just the authors. It is ours as well, because if we require these things to happen, that's where we build.
Okay. Over there, and then over here.
Renan Almeida from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, actually asked you a similar question yesterday, which is, don't you think that you have to find some way to look at the papers that are not accepted in order to get a full view of the peer review impact?
I think the only way to do that is that we contact the authors and ask them, how many times you've got rejected and what kind of comments you got and why didn't you not continue? That's where we can see that. But do not forget that there's been quite a lot of papers that have looked at rejected papers and have just found that they went to another journal. We will see what happens with the medRxiv that has the lowest number of publications so far, but bioRxiv has more than 80% of all preprints published. arXiv has more than 90% of all preprints published. So I think they're all getting published. It's just where is the question.
Gabriel here from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as my friend there. Somehow you analyzed that if these preprints had comments on it, these preprints that you analyzed, they have comments on medRxiv.
So this was a bioRxiv study. We looked previously in another research, not in this one, if they have comments, but as the previous speaker said, there's only around 8 to less than 10% comments that ever come on these. And usually those comments, there's a paper that we've done on exactly that. Only a small percentage of those relate to really methodology and sort of things. And they often come too late in the process because the paper is already undergo peer review in the journal. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't do anything, but the ones that we analyze do not get feedback so quickly to implement it in the submitted version.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you. In 2019, I'm not sure that all journals were actually accepting preprints, as submitted manuscripts that had been published as preprints. Do you think that could have in some way confounded your results? Because things changed dramatically, as we've seen in 2020, and many journals got on board in accepting pre-printed manuscripts.
I think that's why I showed that initial comparison of the field itself. The median impact factor of the journals was higher than the field itself. So at the time, even still, and it seemed that top journals in epidemiology were accepting preprints. So maybe not the top one, but this is still indicating that the higher impact factor journals in epidemiology were accepting them. Okay. So I don't think it was a problem. No.
Yeah.
Hi, Josh Wallach, Yale, not Yale School of Public Health, Emory University. I think I'm more of a discussion than a question to think about some of the really good points that Steve made and that Cameron made about, journals and high impact journals do offer something with peer review. And Joe and I have been talking about this both before and actually during this, thinking about, is there actually more of a pressure test or a demand for sensitivity analyses and ensuring the robustness of the research that's happening at these higher impact factor journals? But in reality, what we are still seeing across these studies, yours, ours, many other great papers, is that there's still the consistency of the primary finding and the primary conclusion. But in many of these high impact journals, there has been that push and that pressure test to ensure that that is actually the case. So yes, they're consistent, but what's happening during peer review is making sure that we are actually getting the results. And again, this is not uniform across journals, but that these results are actually as valid as we hope or they should be. Just a thought.
Okay,
Maybe, but again, remember, these were the top ones as far as we can see for this field.
okay, that's the last question, and thank you very much,